Well, welcome back to the podcast, everyone. This is Sustainable Culture. My name is Jet. I'm your host. This is a podcast about exploring the relationship between humans, society, our psyche, and the natural world. Last time, I had the pleasure of meeting with Sophia and Caitlin from Safe Passage and discussed their work regarding domestic abuse, sexual violence, porn, and the cultural impacts therein. A very important conversation and an incredibly needed organization in our country, and I would say the world. Seriously, if you haven't listened to it yet, highly recommend it. As much as I'd love to celebrate victory here, unfortunately, the Kickstarter campaign was unsuccessful, and we sadly did not reach the finish line on that goal. I'm thinking of some ideas for another backup option for those who'd still like to submit a direct donation in support or something like that. But in the meantime, I want to thank the folks who did donate. Oliver, David, Melons, Matt 1982, Misty Shipman, TJ Taylor, and my wonderful dad. Thank you all so much for getting the campaign to 50%. You all still earned rewards that I'll be sending your way very soon, and you will have a permanent spot on the website as backers on the show. So thank you so much once again for doing what you did. I cannot thank you enough. Keep a lookout on the Instagram page at sustainableculture.online for news about an upcoming trash pickup event. That's right, it's happening. It's taking place on November 10th. I'm just finalizing sponsors and an official location this week. If you haven't been to one of my pickup events, there is always free coffee for volunteers and a nice cozy meet and greet beforehand. It will be the most fun you've ever had picking up trash. So, follow our page and mark your calendars for that. Sustainable Culture Online is where you can find that. So, this week we have a casual, low-key discussion with an old friend of the show. That's right, Bri AKA Peebs is back as a guest host today. Some of you may remember her as a recurring guest. She was featured on episodes 22, 14, and I forget which others. She's also one of the original supporters of the show and has always presented a refreshing take on environmentalism that I have appreciated very much from the start. We are getting into a topic gaining a whole lot of airtime these days, electrification, or the conversion from fossil fuel to electric energy in the US and worldwide. If you followed politics in the last couple of years, you've probably heard about the historical signing of the Inflation Reduction Act, which electrification is a huge part of. It's all over a bunch of sustainability and environmental communities. I have a bunch of strong opinions about it, so I figured a little chat was due. It is a little bit of a longer episode, so find a comfy chair, pick a chore to do or two, and enjoy this on a nice car ride, perhaps, something like that. So, let's go! This is episode 29, The Currents of Electrical Energy, Cultural Shocks Included. So hi, Bri. Long time no talk.
Hey, Jet. How's it going?
It's great. It's great to have you back on the podcast.
I am so happy to be back. It's been a while, and I'm so glad that you reached out.
It's been a hot second since, dear listeners, since we have both discussed environmental topics and just talked, period,
It's
at all.
true. Like, I feel like it's still in my brain, February of 2019, and this last 5 years have been a fever dream, so who even knows what time is?
Seriously. Well, let's start there. I mean, gosh. So I've been on hiatus for 2.5 years. I have been working all kinds of different things out, life be lifing, and just different things like that. And I know you can relate in certain ways. So where have you been the last couple of years? Let's give me whatever you're comfortable with. You moved to Boise.
Yep, moved to Boise. It was the best decision that we've made I love it down here. I took a break from doing like the myofascial type work, and I went and I worked for a wildlife rehab facility for almost a year.
Yeah, because I saw on your Instagram you had these pictures of these birds.
Yep. Yeah, I worked for a bird conservation organization. I was a supervisor there for about a year. And it was a 50-50 bag of like good and bad. I had to quit though because unfortunately with most nonprofit conservation, like it is not a living wage. It's not even close to a living wage.
Yeah.
So it was a really good experience to have while I could do it, but the bills be real. So I had to stop doing that. And it was a good time for me to quit too. So, you know, I have lots of opinions that are not related to this episode about wildlife conservation and the do's and don'ts and why on earth are we doing that type of stuff. Still doing illustration, kind of, not really. But mostly I'm just down here. I'm back to my old job and really just vibing. I love Boise. Boise's fantastic.
What's your favorite part about Boise currently?
Oh my gosh. What is this? Everything
Give me a grab bag if you want.
Okay, so Boise proper itself, the city itself. I'm not talking about the outliers like Meridian and Eagle. Boise itself is extremely walkable. It's very pedestrian friendly, which I really love. So where I'm at, I'm within biking distance or walking distance of every place I frequent weekly. And I always like to joke, like, this hobbit doesn't leave the Shire, and I really don't. If I can't bike somewhere, I'm very not likely to go there. But to build on that, the city proper has been installing far more bark lanes. I have dogs. Can you tell? Bike lanes and pedestrian lanes.
Bark lanes would be pretty cool. I don't know what that would look like, but I would really.
Bark lanes. It's pretty dog friendly down here. So everything's really well connected pedestrian wise, and you don't really see that in Idaho. So that's been like my favorite thing about the city proper. And everyone down here is so friendly, dude. Like, I have opinions about North Idaho, but people down here, it's totally different. So it's...
Does it feel like a different state?
Yeah, I would say so.
I mean, I know it's a big state, but...
Yeah, I think Boise still has a lot of that old school Idaho friendliness that I think North Idaho lacks now, just because it got squished out, honestly. So I'm really happy here. I mean, also the coffee scene is... to die for. So.
Oh yeah, that much I do know. That much I have heard.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about specific places, unfortunately, because I just haven't been down there enough. But I have heard that.
Oh yeah. I have almost zero complaints. The only complaint I have this year is like the wildfires were so bad and we're basically a bowl, and so all the smoke was just like on top of us for 4 months, 3 months, or something like that. But I can't. That's not.
Well, honestly, it's funny you mentioned that because, so when I first started doing episodes again, my first guest, TJ, and her mom, Mama Jill, TJ's husband, Craig, shout out to Craig, is a firefighter. And he actually got deployed down in your area for a couple of weeks with some other firefighters and was sending videos and stuff, and it looked crazy. With some of the photos it looked so apocalyptic. Sad. It looked really crazy. And I just respect firefighters and their work so much it was incredible seeing some of the stuff. Part of it, he was like, it doesn't suck because he was in nature and everything.
True.
But at the same time, it did look like the entire landscape had been burned down, and that was crazy.
You know, it's sad, and I hate to say it. The forest management in Idaho has been pretty not great for the past 40 years, so it needed to happen.
Yeah.
We really needed to burn some stuff out. It sucked that it all happened at once, and like Oregon too, but at least we have a chance to kind of start over, and especially for like, we have a lot of invasive trees in the area that needed to be burned out, so I think it's the ponderosa that need fire to sprout. So we can have a fresh wave of like our native plants and, you know, that good foliage coming in through. So it's going to look a little ugly for a while, but in the long run, I think we needed it. It's like a bad winter. Sometimes you just need it.
Yeah. You know, only a millennial would look outside at apocalypse and go, we needed this.
Where's our yearly apocalypse, our yearly world-ending event? Oh, there it is. Yep, okay.
It's like a fresh rain, but for millennials. You know what? We needed this.
Isn't that terrible? I would really like to live in precedented times, though. I'm very tired of the unprecedented. But I digress.
Yeah, no, I 100% am with you on that. Yeah. God, it's great to talk to you again. I had thought to myself, I was just going to do a solo episode today and just sort of last second come up with something. And it wasn't that I was completely clueless about subject matter necessarily. And we'll talk about that in a second. But I thought it would be a little bit better audio if I had someone to talk with. And I just appreciate you once again for coming on and talking with me.
I'm so glad you texted me. Thanks. I was just like, hell yeah, this is so fun. I love it. I love it.
Thank you for having opinions.
I have many.
Well, let me start then with, okay, so what we're talking about is electrification. And part of the reason for this, by the way, to give you some context and the listeners some context, is I'm back in school, which is I'm just so thankful for. I'm
excited for you because when I first met you, which was like, I don't even know how long ago now.
I think like 2018 or 2019 or something.
It had to have been at least early 2018, and you had been talking about going back to school. And you've been talking about going back to school since then, so I'm so excited for you.
Yeah, it's one of those things, and I swear I don't know if this is only a mid-30s age-wise thing, but it was definitely one of those things where it's like, it's been a couple years since I've been to school, and then I looked at the actual calendar and I go, oh no, it's been 4 years for sure. Yeah. Over 4. Just 2 years just sort of breezed by and I didn't notice, so that's fun. They say time flies, man, but whoa.
Yeah, post-COVID time.
That was just, I think that was where my miscalculation was that I just like to pretend that didn't happen. I think a lot of us do.
Yeah. But anyway, sorry to digress. So you're back in school.
So I'm back in school and I'm taking a climate change mitigation class among another class too, which is a water quality class. Both classes are a ton of fun. I'm having a great time with. But right now in my climate change mitigation class, we are going over the Inflation Reduction Act and we are going over the concept of electrification and why it's needed. And we have these as homework. We have these discussion posts that we're posting. Everybody loves the discussion posts.
Oh yeah. Write at least 3 sentences on the post.
Yeah. And this has been an interesting one for me in general because, you know, along with just the joy of discussion post assignments and everything, sometimes, let's be honest, with these discussion posts, you do have to kind of feign interest somewhat in other people's posts or whatever, because you do get graded on your participation. You have to comment on that and stuff. However, this is a 400 level course and there are grad students taking this course as well. And
okay.
Yeah, so it is a little bit higher in terms of, well, I say higher, that's not really the right term, but it demands a certain amount of interest and attention. And it kind of reminds me of when I took integral calculus.
Ugh.
I know. Yeah, all the listeners now are just like, gross! But I realized that when you get to a certain level of class, or difficulty, I suppose, you start to notice that the class sizes shrink and the interest level is much different looking than just a class that literally everyone has to take to progress to whatever it is that they're doing. I'm in a fortunate position right now where I'm taking only classes, for the most part now, where like all my core classes are done and I can just take like these climate change classes and these water quality classes and how to research effectively. And I'm approaching a lot of really fun, strictly degree related courses like that. And for the listeners, I'm studying environmental science as a bachelor's program. And we'll talk about after that when I get there. But right now, I bring up discussions and discussion posts and stuff like that because I actually thought of this idea today, of this topic today, because of our discussion posts that I had to submit last week, or maybe it was a couple weeks ago. These are that we have a long time to submit these because they want us to really think these things through and pose a good argument. Okay. And this has been a whole battle for me because the the program we're using or the website we're using is fully graded and I guess managed by generative AI. And I'm having a hard time with that.
That feels like oh gosh, we can do an episode on generative AI.
Oh, we will. Oh man, it's so. Speaking of having opinions, yeah, it's so funny. Like I am having a hard time with that, and to give our professor some credit, she told us at the offset during syllabus day and stuff like that. I don't know how I feel about AI. I definitely have mixed opinions at best, and I brought this up with other professors, and they all have mixed opinions at best. So we're going to try this as a discussion board platform.
So AI for science, fine.
AI for science. That is exactly how I felt. Fine. I will give you feedback, and I already have given feedback, and it's been an interesting thing. But I bring this up because this whole experience has been testy for me. Mm-hmm. Because the AI thing, which I would rather do a whole episode on that. I think it's obvious that we both, I'm so mixed on it. And I mean, the entire thing is based on theft. So
yeah, I know. There's a reason why I'm not doing art full time anymore.
Yeah, it's frustrating to say the absolute least. And I'm sorry to hear that, by the way.
It's okay. It's okay. It took me a good year and a half to come to terms with it. But I'm at a point now where I'm like, the traditional arts will always be valued, but the problem is it's not ever going to be a very good source of income anymore, and that's just how it's going to be. That's just how it is, because the crazy thing, and I hate to turn this into an AI episode, but just a quick segue. The crazy thing is you'll talk to a lot of people, like my husband's talked to multiple people, and I'm like, oh yeah, we use it for marketing. Oh yes, we use it for this. And I'm like, you're just junkifying the internet at that point.
You're junkifying it? Is that what you said?
Yeah, or the one thing I do like is this idea of AI prions, like mad cow disease, where eventually the AI is going to start feeding on itself, and eventually it's just going to start pumping out junk.
I saw you post that, and I think that would be fun to talk about on another time. That is such an interesting concept that I hadn't actually thought of, and the idea there being that when something loops into itself enough, it just keeps getting more and more warped. And AI being, as we were saying, based on theft, it's taking the things that it produces from other things that already exist. Eventually, the more it is used, it will be absorbing and using its own creations based on the creations that it got from other things. And then it will just do that again and again and again. And anytime you ever have a situation like that, it just gets worse and more warped and doesn't make sense.
That was my 100% initial argument when this whole thing started coming out about 2 years ago. But again, for another episode.
Well, speaking of things that make us frustrated, so I wanted to read my discussion post to you. Mm-hmm. And we don't have to base the entire episode on this necessarily. I mean, so what if we do? I just thought that discussing this in an open forum is something that you and I tend to do pretty well. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious what would blossom out of this. So I'll just read this. So the way we have to structure this is we have a prompt, aka our thesis, in the form of a question, and then I will read you a couple of paragraphs after that. So my thesis or general statement to start this out or question is as such. How can we expect the general public to care about grand switches to electricity and other climate solutions when we continue to prosper in a country which disregards the basic needs and rights of most people?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's a great way to start.
And before I even read the paragraphs, just to clarify again for listeners who might not be plugged into this sort of thing, no pun intended, if you pardon that expression, electrification is the concept or the general sort of catch-all term for the grand macro-sized switch as a nation or as a world to electric energy from fossil fuels or other sources of energy. Just so everybody is on the same page with that. And so what I write about this is this right here. It is difficult for me to read so many positive outlooks on the idea of electrification when the vast majority of scientists overlook the very real cultural impacts of the effort to move towards it. What's more is we tend to ignore the larger, more complex set of discussions surrounding capitalism and commercialism, which are directly tied to many mental health crises we face as a developed species. When we glorify certain heads of industry, such as Elon Musk, for example, we tend to praise their brains for making electricity sexy, but we couldn't care less how that technology got us here or who has been stepped on in the process. When you look into the finer points of cultural impacts of lithium mining, you will always find a host of tragic stories about a tribe or small community who were swindled and manipulated into leaving their own land because they had no other real choice in the matter. Part of the issue here is we as consumers are often conveniently ignorant of how our luxury commercial goods affect real people's lives overseas, often in third world countries. We are intentionally distracted by shiny new toys, clothes, or coffee, I'm looking at you, Starbucks, without any mention of sourcing or the cultural impact of said sourcing. Lithium mining companies in Zimbabwe, for example, and I'll have a source to share about that in just a second, but lithium mining companies in Zimbabwe, for example, have a long reputation of forcing poor communities with no political weight into displacement via manipulation or threats. Some researchers claim that over 400 indigenous groups have been affected by lithium mining alone. Let me be clear on this. My intention is not to discourage the use of smarter and more efficient technology. As long as our country's technological progress involves the wasting and degrading of other real people's communities, however, I will oppose that movement vehemently. No progress is worth the sacrifice of other human cultures or livelihoods, no matter what income level or developmental status they may come from. For the greater good, be damned.
This is one of my favorite soapboxes. And I agree with you so much because this is the almost identical argument I've had when it comes to electrification of the grid.
And let me just say, before I open this up for discussion, some disclaimers here. We have tons and tons and tons of data. This isn't just empty opinions and hot air. The interesting thing that I found out when I was doing research for this discussion post, because we do have to have sources when we do these. When I was looking this stuff up, I was struck by the sheer magnitude of and the results of stories that you can find to back these statements up. And I know for some people who are really, really pro electricity and electric cars and things like that, it's difficult to hear stuff like this sometimes, or maybe frustrating because it can seem like a halt to a very necessary progress regarding climate change emissions and things like that. And I understand that, and I'm all the way here for that conversation. But what's freaking crazy to me is when you research these things, when you research lithium mining, you will find, certainly, like anything, you will find a host of very warped and conspiratorial stuff on that sort of thing. Yeah, that's there. But you will also find a huge number of peer-reviewed studies that have been done. You will find cultural studies that have been done. You will find organizations who are working against this with communities that don't have their own legal prowess or financial resources available. There are so much data, I guess, to find on this. And so this isn't just my opinion. And I was actually, and I must say, I was particularly pleased and a little bit surprised and encouraged how many other people in just my class have similar viewpoints on this. And so the main point I wanted to make as a disclaimer here with this sort of long-winded disclaimer is that this is not new. This isn't exactly news. And the general public, not just science students and science people or science enthusiasts or whatever, most people are wisening up to this. And so when I hear about scientists going, why are we having such a hard time getting climate change emissions under control, especially in the US and things like that, and I'm watching all of these struggles and these frustrations from the scientific community regarding switching over to cleaner energy sources and things like that, what's really frustrating, and I think where we start to shoot ourselves in the foot, is the lack of ability to acknowledge these things effectively and to speak towards it. And the way that it's being done, the way that they are acknowledging it, is just to not acknowledge it. They just breeze right over it. I even read a study on MIT. They were like, yeah, lithium mining is dirty for the environment. We acknowledge that. But then that was all they said. They didn't even say anything about cultural impacts, societal impacts overseas, because it is usually in underdeveloped countries. And it is usually indigenous societies and populations that are affected by these things. And so it blows my mind. The more you look into this, it is hard to accept this as a truly viable switch that we need to be making, even though it's not without merit. It's just that it is entirely problematic in how we get this energy. So I wanted to make that disclaimer before I open it up to you.
Have you read Blood and Earth? It's Blood and Earth, Modern Slavery, Ecocide, and the Secret to Saving the Environment. It's one of the best books I've ever read.
No.
He talks, it's an investigative journalist, and he talks about, I think there's cadmium or lithium in there, but he talks about multiple industries, where basically the only reason why we're able to live the way we do is because we truly do rely on what we don't like to say, but what is truly modern slavery in these underdeveloped nations. And
we don't use that term, and we try and say that these...
Actually.
We should, and what's interesting, and I don't mean to interject too soon here, but I think it's interesting. When you say slavery, I agree with you, and it's just fascinating because we think, well, some of these people are being paid, so it doesn't equate to slavery, but there's all kinds of things we could say about manipulative tactics regarding contracts we put people under, and Starbucks, I mentioned, is one of the worst organizations out there that is part of this sort of thing. It's just really difficult to find information on it because of who they are as a company and the fact that they have over 12,000 locations worldwide.
Absolutely. I mean, fast fashion is the same way, which I know we talked about.
Yeah, I thought of that, yeah.
But, just because you're paying someone money doesn't mean it's not slavery. I mean, slaves can be given a stipend. The concept of slavery is more than just, are you paying them or not? It's about equity. It's about, equality and justice and basically shared responsibility in a culture, which that's not happening in a lot of these underdeveloped nations. And after I read Blood and Earth, and I read this years ago, my entire viewpoint on electrification is why I agree with you so heavily that I didn't know I was going to, because I wasn't sure which angle you were going at.
Yeah, I didn't tell Bri anything before we got started today.
This is actually one of the biggest arguments I have for electrification. And there's that big thing, which I think you just mentioned, the whole not in my backyardism. In Idaho, we're the gem state. We have a lot of rare minerals here. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of fights right now about reopening certain mines. And a mine just got approved. It was like 20 years of fighting. It's called the Stibnite mine. It's an antimony and copper mine. And antimony is used in, I think, lead charge batteries, if I'm not mistaken. You'll have to fact check me.
Antimony?
Antimony, yeah. But the problem is where it's at. It's, I think, again, fact checking on this one, it's either in the middle fork or the headwaters of the Boise River, which is north of us. So it's our water source. It's the southern half of Idaho's water source.
Gotcha.
And it's open pit mines. And, they're like, oh, well, we have all this environmental responsibility built into our blah, 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 blah. The problem is the land out there is already, toxic. And if you look at Idaho's history of mining, we don't exactly get an A+ on toxic metal mining, especially where you're at.
I was just going to comment. Yeah, the Coeur d'Alene Lake is beautiful and all, and people swim in it all day long, all the time, every year. But there are several, not just one, but there are several heavy metal mines, silver.
75 million tons of lead, zinc, and arsenic sitting at the bottom of the lake, just waiting for eutrophication so it can just bubble to the surface, which is actually starting to do. So, with all of these protections we have in place in America, it is much easier to go to a third world country and to start strip mining, basically, which is what's happening. I think most people would, recognize, they might want to put it from their mind, but this iPhone I'm staring at right now, most certainly had child mining labor in it. There's a lot of organizations say, oh, we don't use child labor, but when you actually want to investigate, they don't track their sources very well. They don't give a crap. Just keep my language together today.
This is it's up to you, by the way. This is not a clean podcast anymore.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I'll just let my personality flow then. The other thing that I wanted to clarify with you before we go on is it is great to have this like idea of electrifying the grid, whatever. But are you saying most of the electricity that's going to be generated from renewables or fossil fuels, or are we still within like nebulous phase?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, like where you're going with this. Because one of the other things that my big criticism of electrifying the grid is, where are you sourcing your electricity from? So cool, you have an electric car, you've got an electric whatever, electric smart house, whatever, but there's a lot of areas in the US that aren't set up for renewables, can't have renewables, or it's still cheaper to use, natural gas and stuff like that. So I'm just going to come straight out the gate. And for me personally, given all of the research we have right now, given all of our resources, we need to be doing nuclear if we're going to electrify the grid and if we're going to make it happen quickly.
Yeah, I agree. And it's a shame that, and myself included, there's a big caution around nuclear energy for all these legitimately good reasons.
Sure.
Especially considering what we know about where nuclear energy where it has failed.
Yeah.
Chernobyl being one of the most public examples of that.
Yes.
Yeah. And crazy fact, by the way, I don't know if you've ever dived down this rabbit hole, but there are crazy photos and documented videos and all kinds of stuff that have been done on the wildlife that now lives in Chernobyl and the mutations that have been taking place. It's pretty crazy.
It is crazy.
It's like something out of Fallout, the video game, or
Fallout being its own warning story.
Yeah. But, to answer your question, though, as far as more specifically, like what I'm talking about regarding electrification and what's being electrified, definitely electric vehicles are a huge focus because of the lithium mining required for those batteries. Sure. That's, I would say, the fastest growing industrial thing regarding electrification. And it is not being met with no resistance. Like, there is definitely resistance there in certain parts of the country. I just did a little bit of a report just yesterday, in fact, on Alabama and the resistance that is there. There's a growth in population, but there is a straight up disbelief about, first off, climate change as a concept, but also as, since that is sort of devalued and invalidated is what I'm trying to say. The use of electric cars is more aesthetic than it is for a specific purpose, and especially with things like, I mentioned Elon Musk, and I don't want to get caught on Elon Musk. I think he's an easy target for all kinds of funny reasons.
Sure. That's the thing. He is an easy target.
Yeah, I use that as an example because in pop culture now, he has become such a phenomenon. Not even just pop culture. He's just a prominent person in the world now. He's like kind of the closest thing to a Tony Stark we have. Yeah. Which is weird. But I use him as an example because everybody knows Tesla, and I think that a lot of things that are happening as far as electric vehicles are fantastic as far as things. But I also did, as you know, that class we mentioned together, I can't remember if it was the same class, but I did this whole report on transportation in America and battery types. So I mentioned electric vehicles for sure. I'm definitely referring to that. But I'm also referring to things like switching different, improving the grid is one thing. The grid conversation, I feel like, is its own situation, though. Okay, we need to improve the grid, I think, objectively. Yeah. As far as like domestic infrastructure as a whole needs to be improved. Yeah. For all kinds of different reasons. Safety. But I totally acknowledge the fact. Oh, and this was the other thing that I was going to mention. I was blanking on this and I was kind of trying to remember it. Where I'm mostly focused on definitely is electric vehicles. That is big and prominent to me. The energy grid thing, I feel like it's its own bubble, and we can talk about that still. But I don't feel like that's as concerning necessarily. I think it has concerns just like anything else could have concerns. There's potential concerns. But where I am most concerned about, and this branches into political ideologies too, because you can't help it, because it involves people and entire cities and cultures, is in places like West Virginia, where you have entire coal mining communities, where this is people's jobs. Whether they like it or not is not some city person's judgment to make. And oftentimes you hear a lot of politicians going, oh, these are dirty jobs, and how awful it is that people are still coal miners and things like that. But I think we neglect the fact that there are entire communities who, whether they like it or not, is less of a topic. and is more, this is what we do. This is who we are. This is a pride that our society has had for generations and generations. And we always hear a lot of politicians say things like, it's usually politicians, but we also hear a lot of people in the scientific community say things like, well, when we switch over to electric energy and electric infrastructure, we'll just be able to provide new jobs. And I think there's some validity in that. We can talk about that, but at the same time, I think it's rather convenient to just say, oh, we'll just have new jobs. But how do you know that the people that work in these, let's just say coal mining jobs, since that's my example, how do you know that they want to do that? How do you know that they care? How do you know that they're going to be qualified? Like who's doing that work? And every time that concept is brought up in scientific communities and discussions, there's never a solid answer, because the truth is we just really haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, too, is you have this giant push for change, and people are like, oh, all you got to do is vote. All you got to do is vote for change. The people who are voting are the people who are trying to save their identity. You can't rip people's identity away. And I know that's what you're trying to say.
Yeah.
And that is a huge oversight. So you're not going to see change unless you actually start listening to the people who this affects the most. And usually, correct me if I'm wrong, especially in America, unless you're fracking, most of these coal mining towns are very poor. Mm-hmm. And it is wrapped up in their identity of, this is what we do. We're hardworking. We love our families. This is our life. You can't just go in and say, well, oops, sorry, you can't have that anymore, without giving them a viable alternative. And you're right, they might not even want it. More often than not, I would say a lot of these people don't want it. And you can't really fault them for that either. This is kind of stuff that has to die out slowly over generations. And I think where the scientific community gets frustrated is we don't necessarily have generations for certain things. Mm-hmm. And so how do you tackle the human problem? And honestly, I don't know, because, as we see in politics today, there's a ton of empty promises. And I think some of these promises that are coming from the scientific community are valid, but the problem is they don't have the backing for anything to come from them. So they end up showing up looking like empty promises, if you get what I'm saying.
I do. Well, and that actually, to back that up, I think sometimes those empty promises or broken promises, or just the legacy, and it turns out being like a dark legacy, is visually apparent because you have situations like, I can't remember the name of the town, but I want to say it's Pennsylvania. There's a really cool book, I liked it, called A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. It's his experience, his personal experience walking the Appalachian Trail in pieces. And so when he was in I think it's Pennsylvania, and I might be wrong on the state, but a friend of mine actually posted recently on Facebook. He actually visited this place, which is pretty crazy. But there's a place where, again, I think it's in Pennsylvania, but there is a coal fire that has been present underground for decades, and it is still burning. And so the ground is still smoky. And so you can go there and you can visit, but it is a literal ghost town that isn't lived in anymore because it's unsafe. They had to move this entire town. Some coal fire got started at some point, and they weren't able to put it out. It's like impossible to put out, essentially. And the coal is just, to this day, still burning.
Crazy.
Is that nuts? And so they had to move this entire town out. So you can go visit and everything, and it's fine to visit, but no one in their right mind would want to live there, because I can't imagine the health problems, the lung issues that you would have.
I'm pretty sure that's called the Gates of Hell in Pennsylvania.
Is it? In fact, I could just look this up. The Gates of Hell.
Oh, no, that's just ghost stories. There is another fire going on somewhere that's similar to that. That's called like the Gates of Hell or something.
Oh no, this is something totally different. But no, there's a place over in that area that is pretty wild, and so you have this dark legacy of an industry that can't continue anymore. And then another example that I think of is actually where my dad is from. My whole dad's side of the family is from Maine. Little fun fact about me. And
did not know that.
Yeah, well, here you go. And so there is a little town called Medway, Maine. And in Medway, and it is a very small town, there's an entire segment of an already small town of houses that are boarded up and condemned and stuff. And it's because there is also still, the building is still there, It's this old mill that I don't know if it's open and running anymore. If so, there's very few people there at all. I don't think it runs at all anymore, but it used to be this old, I think it was a paper mill. And as that industry became more online and as larger companies like Staples and things like that gained more prominence, and just online shopping became more of a thing, and overseas sourcing and things like that, less and less people were able to continue their jobs doing that. I don't see how electrification of, like, let's say coal firing communities and things like that, coal mining communities, will be much different the more we progress through this. And so what you're going to end up with is, yeah, okay, maybe they're going to have new jobs and everything. At best, we can hope for that.
Yeah.
But even so, you're going to have these entire areas of town that are now ghost towns that don't get used. And that has its own series of environmental impacts in terms of cultural issues that
Sure.
I always tend to come back to.
Well, and to add to that too, I think there's also this, like, the scientific community also feels like this, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Sense of urgency. Like, we got to do something now. We got to do something now. But where we're at in our culture right now, electrification of anything is going to be, I think, personally, a slow transition. Because most of our energy sources, unless you live like in Idaho, southern Idaho, we're all hydroelectric power. But say you live in Virginia, Pennsylvania, maybe your electricity that you're powering your Tesla with, that could be coal electricity. So until you can replace that, and that's going to be really, really slow because, as you and I both know, infrastructure doesn't change overnight, let alone people change overnight. So there is, I think, a lack of, maybe not a lack of acknowledgement in the scientific community, but maybe a lack of acknowledgement that we still rely on heavily our current systems of energy, to the point where I think for especially a lot of people, that reliance to not rely on it seems almost impossible because of just how much we're pulling from non-renewable sources. And even so, like, there, I hate to be like this person, but even with renewable energy sources, you and I know, because we both talked about this in other episodes, renewable does not mean eco-friendly all the time. I mean,
no.
You're damming certain rivers, you're destroying species. Wind turbines can't be recycled, and some birds are being like wiped out from them. So
the birds, they're killing all the birds.
It's not as many birds as people think. House cats still actually take out most of the birds, but it's just one of those things where less about the birds, more about like when you have to decommission a windmill, what do they do with the blades, basically?
Yeah, and that's it's the same sort of tone that I'm bringing up with things that were just subjects that we're just breezing over. There's this huge mistrust, this dichotomy of the left versus the right, and the red and the blue and all this stuff, Democrats and Republicans, and it's frustrating to be. I feel like as an environmentalist, there are a lot of polar environmentalists, certainly, that firmly stand on one side of the spectrum. But I think the more you start to study things, it's harder to pick a side. And
you almost can't.
You can't because you start to see that both parties are highly dishonest and conveniently ignorant of different things, such as how we, bury a lot of the parts for these old tired windmills and stuff.
Yeah.
That all does happen. That all is real.
Yeah.
But to pretend that it doesn't is where the distrust comes from. To just not talk about it and furthermore, to criticize people who try and bring it up.
Yeah.
Is one of the worst moves that we have made as a scientific community in this country. By criticizing people for being interested in legitimate concerns. Science itself is based on skepticism, and people are just going through the scientific method by going, what about this though? And we just criticize them for it. It just seems like a huge disservice that we're doing ourselves.
For sure. And it's incredibly divisive, I think, as well. Like, how on earth are we supposed to solve these problems if we don't bring in the skepticism? You have to.
Yeah.
And I think people are threatened by skepticism. They think it more of like a personal attack, which I don't think it needs to be. And again, I consider myself very much an environmentalist. I live in a city that considers environmentalism a big deal. Like half the city is run by geothermal power. Like, we're very green. We're very walkable. We're very this. You know, Idaho is actually, considering our demographics, we're a very green state if you really look at where we're getting most.
There's actually a lady, I wish I could remember her name, but she's a doctor there who is an engineer who is converting plastic into diesel fuel. Mm-hmm. Then that's happening in Boise. I remember researching that like 4 or 5 years ago, probably closer to the last time we talked. There's a lot of cool stuff in Boise.
Yeah, and we have because, you know, we're a smaller state, most of us like to be outside. I think we're all just naturally, you know, conservationists here. So I think I would like to believe that Idaho in its core is more open to different energy ideas.
Yeah.
But every single time we get close to an election year and these things get brought up, I feel like we go back 20 paces every single time. So,
well, our leadership hasn't exactly encouraged discourse.
No.
It's always take a side or F off. And it's...
Yeah, and I honestly, I want to go back to your very, very first point. We're talking about relying basically on modern slavery for how we are existing in the world, especially with this electrification of the grid. And yes, do we need to electrify? Yes, I absolutely think we do. I don't think combustion engines are the greatest thing. You know me, I love the ocean, so I have lots to say about the ocean being a carbon sink. We got to figure out a way to stop that.
I want to talk about that some more, but please continue your point.
Oh, but I was just going to say, there has to be, and I hate to say this because people get so offended by it, if we do not start individually waking up and taking personal responsibility for things, and I understand this idea of yes, the problem is so massive, what are you going to do about it as a single individual? I think if everyone realized oh, I'm cozy because an 8-year-old kid is suffering so that I can use my iPhone to scroll TikTok in the morning. If we could just acknowledge that. Yeah. I'm not saying suffer guilt from it, even though I think maybe we should all have a little bit of collective guilt for it. And I'm just saying if we could just be aware of that and acknowledge it and not pretend like it's not happening, we would be able to move forward.
Right.
The problem is it's extremely difficult in our information age where we're over-informationized, which is not a word, but you get what I'm saying.
I totally get it.
It is so easy to distract oneself from one's personal responsibility in the world. One of the beautiful things about culture and being within a society is this idea of the social contract. The idea of the social contract is we all have to basically agree on very specific individual or collective ideas that hold us together. And if we can't all agree on this idea of we each play a role in a global collective at the expense of small children, I honestly think we can't move forward with electrification, period.
I don't think we can either. I mean, it because it speaks to this whole thing about it's not our individual faults that this is happening, but by avoiding the conversation altogether, no one has the ability to kind of put their voice at the table and even ask questions like, well, what am I supposed to do? You know, a lot of times if by just not having those conversations, it can be a real big struggle.
Sure.
I want to
honestly. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I just want to say I want to, because we've got plenty more we want to talk about real quick. Yes. I can hear the dogs yelping in my background, and I want to take a real brief break here. You and I will stay on, but I want to just give this a quick pause, and then for listeners, and then we'll come back, and I want to address that some more, and I also want to get into more of the ocean being a carbon sink, what that means, and talk about how we're missing out on some opportunities there and some of the stuff
that. My favorite soapbox.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. So we'll be right back. are back. Thank you for bearing with me, Bri, with that break. Are you going by Bri or PB these days anyway?
I honestly don't know. My best friends call me Peebs, and it's just been that way.
Yeah, you've been Peebs for a hot second.
I know, and it just kind of just depends on what people want to call me, honestly.
Okay.
Like, most people on the internet know me by PB or Peebs.
Yeah.
And so I'm fine with it.
I call you Bri for the sake of just correctly identifying you as a human being, but you know what I mean? Like, but Peebs works.
Like, well, no, because when you met me, that's what, I was going by, so it's totally fine.
Well, it's
like,
funny,
it took me
too.
a hot minute to, not say Josh all the time.
Honestly, I was just gonna point on that is I always know how long someone has known me by if they refer to me as Josh or Jet, and a lot of listeners right now are probably going, "Excuse me, who's Josh?"
Yeah.
But Josh being my given name, I have no issues with or qualms with that. It's just Jet has been linked to me for so long. I've just identified with it just as much as I have with my given name. So. I don't mean to overly formalize you, Peebs.
Oh, no, you're totally fine. Like, if people want to call me PB or Peebs, that's fine. I'll respond to both. Bri's fine. Brianna's fine. It just depends.
I will never call you Brianna. I will never call you Brianna. I will never do that.
That almost feels like too formal, right?
It's too much. It's too much. I'm not calling you to ask you to apply for a loan or to talk about your insurance policy.
Brianna is my work name. Like, when I go into the office and I'm working with clients, that is my name.
Perfect.
That's my business name.
I can totally see that. That's much more fitting in that, like, a legal environment.
Yeah, but, my total, chaotic social breakdown name is Peebs, and that's a long story, so we don't have to get into it.
Well, before the break, we were talking, we just barely touched on the fact that, well, first off, for those of you who do not know and don't follow Peebs on her Instagram, first off, you should. Her art is incredible.
I'm on every now and then. I need to get back onto my wild brood /
How many pages do you have now? Because you're doing massage therapy again.
Mm-hmm. I have 3. So what I do, just because as we're talking on the break, this whole social media thing, I actually have a time limit on my iPad. I don't keep social media on my phone. 15 minutes a day, I go in, check my business accounts, and peace out. So
I need to do that. I keep getting sucked into the scroll of doom, and I'm not even on TikTok. And I will just go.
I know it's too tempting for me. I know myself after, again, going back to that whole COVID era where I got so sucked into social media. I know what it does to my brain.
Yeah.
And I have to parent myself on this one, and so 15 minutes tops.
Well, good for you.
I have 3 accounts.
Okay, you should follow pb.doodles for sure. Mm-hmm. If nothing else, just to look back at the archive of incredible art from our co-favorite book series, Red Rising.
Yeah, and I'm actually working on new art for Red Rising right now, which I said I was never going to do, but I'm actually doing it again. So.
Oh, man, I love that stuff, and the fact that you've even talked to Pierce Brown, the author, and have done collaborative work with him is got to be up at the top of the list of things I'm most jealous of.
It was such a surreal experience, my friend. It was wild.
Yeah, you sent me this picture of, I think, you guys on a Zoom call with some other folks, and I was losing my mind when you sent me that. Could not believe it. So I wanted to kind of we're going to talk about ocean stuff in just a second, because what I was going to say is that you, as a hobby, go scuba diving pretty often still, right?
I haven't. Well, I dove Coeur d'Alene Lake a couple months ago. We were up there for 2 days. But I haven't been in the ocean since November of 2 years ago.
Oh, it's been that long. Okay.
Yeah, there's been a lot. We had to catch up. When we did move, we became housebroke very fast. So, being an adult's so fun.
Well, it's nice to feel comfortable at home.
Well, the house that we ended up buying, because as everyone knows, the housing market's something else.
Oh, yeah.
It needs a lot of work. So.
Yeah.
And that's okay. So we had to prioritize, but we will be going back to the reef soon-ish to do more diving. But yeah, it is a hobby when I can do it, when I can get to the ocean, even just to touch the water, I'm there.
Well, so when it comes to people in touch with the health of the ocean, it's the people who are in the water the most.
Yes.
So when we talk about things like switching energy sources, you have to address things like carbon emissions. And
Absolutely.
not just CO2, but we're also talking about, in this class that I was mentioning at the top of this, we're talking about things that like fluorinated gases that I wish I knew more about, but essentially I want to just, a lot of people call them F gases. Some folks are old enough to remember the hole we tore in the ozone back in the 70s. I think it was 70s?
Sometime.
It was before both of our
Everyone needed their
time.
hairspray.
I'm going to sound,
Refrigeration.
yeah, I'm going to sound so young at this point. It's nice to, you know what? It's nice to feel young again right now.
I know.
So I'm just going to say, I forget if it was the 70s. But anyway, we had torn a hole in the ozone with all this hairspray, like you had mentioned. And it was mostly hairspray and other things like that, these compressed things that we were spraying.
Refrigerants were a big one.
Refrigerants. And so we switched the gas type essentially to these fluorinated gases. And what we're finding is that it's better for the ozone, but these are gases that still get trapped as greenhouse gases. Mm-hmm. And so they do still heat things up. The interesting thing is, I had mentioned earlier that I had done this sort of a little bit of a research assignment on Alabama. And I don't mean to pick on Alabama, it's just that this is the specific data that I had looked at. But since 1990, so just in the last 30 years or so, 25, 30 years, since 1990, they didn't used to use any of those gases, but since the switch, what we've seen is like a 378,000% increase in use. That's a really
little increase.
As a math-brained person, I have a hard time understanding that as a concept of a number, but they have increased use of these fluorinated gases by a stupid amount. And what this is linked to, and the reason I bring this up, is because when you talk about switching energy sources from fossil fuel to electric, you have to address things like population increases and things like that. So with population increasing, with more modern technology coming out, you talk about things like electric cars or just more modern cars. Everything has an AC unit now. Refrigerants, you mentioned.
Hybrids, you've got the refrigerants and you've got the lithium batteries.
Absolutely.
It's everywhere.
Absolutely. What is particularly fascinating about F gases, and the reason I'm even bringing these up, in case it feels like it's totally out of left field for listeners here, is because when they get put into the atmosphere, F gases are particularly troublesome and concerning because of their lifespan and how long they stay within the atmosphere. So neither of us are experts, and we acknowledge this. We're both enthusiasts, and we have opinions and things like that. But the true science of F gases, really, without giving you like solid numbers, I forget the amount of years, but some thousands of years that they stay within our sort of bubble that we have as a planet. And the heat capacity that they hold is drastically higher than CO2 and nitrogen and other things like that. So the reason I bring this up is because when we talk about F gases, when we talk about CO2 and things like that, there are lots of ways that are still developing in science of sort of sucking these gases out of the atmosphere. The science isn't really quite there yet, and the technology isn't quite there yet. So what we're left to rely on currently is natural processes which sort of inhale these sorts of types of gases. One of the biggest ones is the ocean.
Yes, it is.
As what we call a carbon sink or a sink.
Yes, in fact, the ocean absorbs 93% of excess heat. So, with that said, if we did not have the ocean absorbing all this excess heat, the surface of the planet would be 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Right now, it's roughly 54, 57 degrees Fahrenheit. It would be unlivable.
It'd be 122?
122 degrees Fahrenheit without the ocean sinking this heat. So we need the ocean as a heat sink and also as a carbon sink. And the reason why we were talking about the ocean is because the entire rush towards electrification is how do we cut these carbon emissions? How do we stop these fossil fuel carbon emissions? Which, carbon's a greenhouse gas, which is trapping heat. So you have this twofold process here. And as I was telling Jet on break, most people, the average Joe, looks outside and I don't see climate change. And that's valid. Most people don't. You're not going to look outside and just be like, oh, wow, the elm tree's on fire. That's not how climate change works. As an ocean enthusiast, being in the ocean and having done coral restoration and having been in these reefs, I hate to appeal to authority because it's a logical fallacy, but I can at least speak from experience here where we're having this massive change in where this carbon is, not massive change in shifting, it's a speeding up of this process.
Yeah.
So yes, we're seeing two things happening in the ocean because of this slow drag of like, well, we gotta get rid of carbon and fossil fuels, it's just not happening. The ocean is saving us from ourselves, and it's saving us from really seeing these massive global climate changes. The problem is eventually the ocean is not a infinite sink. It's just not. So when you talk about absorbing heat, the ocean temperature is rising. If you go to the NOAA, there's a coral heat map. The coral heat wave spikes have been just absolutely off the charts this past year. So we know that the ocean temperature is rising, and it is absolutely bleaching coral. And that's a whole other thing, which I can get into later. But the problem, with ocean temperatures rising isn't so much of like killing off biodiversity, which is a terrible thing, because if you kill off coral reefs and they start to die, like say in Florida, and you have a massive storm come in, the only thing protecting the land is these giant like barriers, so you lose that. But we also start seeing the shifting of these ocean currents. Ocean currents are convections, like a convection oven. So you have rising water that's hot that rises, and the water that cools falls. So you get these convection currents.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So what happens is, as we start to heat up, it's changing how these currents work, which is going to shift weather patterns. And that's where you start seeing these massive storms coming through.
Yeah, this is where people talk about El Nino, El Niña.
Sure. Yeah, and so, you start seeing weird droughts happening in Europe all of a sudden. Flooding happening over here all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And if you look at like ocean temperature, and if you know how these currents work, you go, oh yeah, well, by basic physics, that makes sense. The second thing that, is worrisome about the ocean is this idea of being a carbon sink. The ocean absorbs a crap ton of carbon dioxide. What happens is there is a natural process of, the ocean's going to always absorb carbon. The problem is how much we're spitting out and how much the ocean's taking in. And the carbon isn't just carbon hanging out in the ocean. It turns into something called carbonic acid when it hits the seawater. The problem with anything acidic is you have these creatures like coral, crabs, shrimp, plankton, anything that has a calcium shell, now being put into these more acidic environments, and we're noticing developmental problems. Their shells aren't developing correctly. They're not reaching maturity. They're not growing as fast. They're not healthy. They're getting sick, blah, 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 blah. So you're having a 1-2 punch on biodiversity because of the, rising temperatures and also this acidification. My personal thing is with acidification is like loss of biodiversity. I can't really speak beyond that because what I worked with was, coral restoration, looking at all this stuff. If we start losing our coral reefs, what we're finding is going back to this idea of we have a responsibility to cultures around the world. If you start killing off coral reefs, you start killing fish nurseries. You have to have fish nurseries to have healthy fisheries. Fish is one of the most popular proteins around the world. So you're going to start seeing not only like bad weather changes, but possibly mass starvations.
And this speaks to, if I can interject, this speaks.
Go for it.
This is part of the struggle point of this concept of switching our energy source as a nation or as a world, as a planet, because what you're talking about is so important and not really talked about enough, I think. There's a lot of people who do talk about it, but it's like you don't hear about it unless you follow certain scientists or groups or whatever. But the interesting struggle point, I would just like to point out to keep this focused on this energy switch that we're talking about at large is, coral reef health and biodiversity. We talk about in freshwater, especially, we talk about algal blooms, which are becoming more prevalent because of different nutrients that are being, at least not enough nutrients are going into the water, or too many nutrients are being put into the water, depends. But the reason all this is related to this energy switch concept here is because of the fact that those issues are directly tied to the fuel sources that we use because of, carbon emissions and everything like that. But, and however, when we switch to things like electricity, over time, that will help these issues, certainly. And we know that. The problem is the initial impact of these mining operations and things like that support the powering of all these things. It's just a difficult thing to talk about because what you're talking about is so important, and without promoting the health of the ocean, we won't be able to absorb all the carbon and everything like that. I mean, it's not everything, but it's definitely one of the biggest impacts that we'll have. But when we're ignoring a lot of these, I was mentioning indigenous cultures and things like that. A lot of these indigenous cultures are on the coast.
Yeah.
And these are people who take care of the reef and ocean health and biodiversity a lot more than I would say the general public. And so when we're essentially relocating these entire cultures of people and populations of people and things like that, I would say that that's a direct link among some other things that I go to in my brain, at least, when you're talking about, we need to be able to have more projects to encourage the health of these ecosystems and to bring back these ecosystems. We need the knowledge of these people, and we're also putting them out of house and home from a lot of these projects.
If you look at a lot of like coral Congress, whatever, with the coral scientists, a lot of coral scientists have completely lost hope in actually saving corals, aside from the ones that have been hybrid. There's an argument right now is like, do we hybridize them? Do we genetically modify them? One of the best Noah's Ark of corals in the world is actually home aquariums, which is really
home aquariums, yeah.
So one of the strategies is what you're saying. You give power back to the indigenous peoples. In Roatan, where I was doing a lot of the coral restoration work, it's very much a local push of like, this is these people's land. Which, by the way, the reefs in Roatan were completely wiped out. It was like super sad. First time I cried underwater, whatever.
Oh my gosh!
It was a mixture of the coral wasting disease and a bunch of other stuff. But there's this idea that people don't like to, one, everything's connected. You cannot separate these pieces. It's a wheel, basically, which we've talked about. And the other thing is like, everything has a price. And the only real way to change this is massive sacrifice for our generation and the next generation. And the thing is that people don't like to sacrifice. We have been raised in a culture that is very cozy and comfy. And this idea of personal sacrifice is not something that we grow up with. It's something that's very difficult to do. And because it takes such, this idea of sacrifice is such a hard concept, I don't know really where to go. And I understand where a lot of coral scientists have completely lost hope.
Yeah.
So it really truly does come down to where are we at in 2024? We are using way too much carbon, or we're outputting too much carbon because we are using fossil fuels. Electrification is a great way to solve that as long as we're, electrifying things with more renewables and or nuclear, which is the hill I'm going to die on. And understanding that the transition is going to take time and it's going to make a lot of people upset. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that is supposed to be, and again, I feel like I should just state a couple times, I should have probably stated this earlier, but we got together to talk today, dear listener, not to solve all these problems because neither of us are experts on this, and we have both learned a lot, but we are both still learning a lot. And
oh, for sure.
I think that more conversations like this, just casual conversations like this, need to keep happening to bring an awareness to things, to bring an awareness to the fact that electrification is not something that I am saying that needs to go away or that you're saying that needs to just not happen.
No.
We do need to switch our energy source, and I do promote electricity as one of those energy sources, but not at the cost of communities. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about this, I keep going back to the people affected. So you were talking about reef health and things like that. And I think of an easy one to talk about. It's not a small indigenous culture anymore, but the folks in Hawaii and the University of Hawaii, I forget which one.
I know which one you're talking about, and I have seen the reefs in Hawaii. I was there after their last die-off.
Really?
Yep.
I know that they were doing a lot of work at restoring these things, but what kind of stuff did you see when you were down there?
So most people think Hawaiian corals are like Caribbean coral, where it's like beautiful and bright, and you think Finding Nemo. It's not. It's cold water. It's not technically cold water. Hawaii is a lot colder, so it's like happy temperature for this coral is like 73 degrees, if I remember correctly.
Gotcha.
You're looking at expanses, just absolute expanses of dead coral covered in brown algae, and that's all it looks like. That most Hawaiian corals like red. It's more earthy colored. This is just dead. It's just covered in slime. Again, mind you, this was years ago. I don't know the most recent die-off. I should have said a couple die-offs ago. The problem is it's killing off so much so quickly that bringing it back, because coral takes a long time to grow. I mean, little polyps. That this is where, again, we go back to this idea of a sense of urgency. Like, why do we need these things? Why do we need to consider electrification? Why do we need to consider, like, I wouldn't say anti-consumption, but like bringing it in a bit, I
would just like to say to that note that when we're talking about the importance and the urgency you mentioned, first off, it's really sad to hear about what you witnessed. I know that a lot of people down there, from what I have read, really try to be optimistic about the progress that they have made with these restoration efforts. I almost said restoration efforts, which should be coined.
You should have said that.
Should be coined. I should have said that to begin with. But I think it's important to still have that optimism, that hope, but acknowledging the reality of something doom and gloomy is difficult. But at the same time, I think it's important to see these things for what they are, because it brings into perspective the urgency of all of this.
I think that's a really good point you bring up. I think we need to start accepting this idea of doom and gloom instead of self-medicating.
Yeah, not in the way of like fear-mongering either. Like no, I've had people call me a fear-mongerer before, which was really weird for me to hear.
That's weird.
I know.
I would say an acknowledgement of reality.
Yeah. An acknowledgement of reality, accepting what is. I'm actually reading Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now right now.
Yeah.
And
that's a good one.
He talks extensively about accepting what is.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's the thing. If we don't accept what is, how on earth are we supposed to change the problem?
Precisely the point. That is precisely the point that he makes in that book. And it's so important to acknowledge what is, because you get to spot the opportunities therein.
Mm-hmm.
And so
I think the interesting thing is people do not like to be called out.
No, they don't. And it's like, well, why do you got to point fingers and stuff? And this is why this is such a not just a conversation, but a field full of subtleties, nuance. And this goes back to our original point about not really creating a culture of discourse in this country, especially in this country. I'm just saying U.S. as a country, because that's all I can really speak to. We're not the only country that doesn't have room for discourse. I understand that there's a lot of polarized opinions out there. And a lot of the reasons why is, I hate to say it, but political leadership and scientific leadership has been poor, not just here, but in the world, I think.
Yeah, and then, of course, I like to throw in that social media drive, because I hate social media.
Yeah.
I think it could have been used as such a great tool.
Yeah.
But
I'm avoiding getting a TikTok for so hard, but
Don't do it, dude. Don't do it.
I might. We'll talk. Don't judge me. We'll talk about that later.
I'm not judging. I'm just saying it is perfectly and precisely attuned to keep you addicted and
absolutely
confused.
I don't know. I'm still deciding on how I feel about that. Much like this discussion post thing, how I read at the top of this, like I'm still deciding where it's useful and where it isn't, and things like that. I know for growing an audience, it would be very useful. But
so I guess my next question is just to kind of tie this together.
Yes, because we've been kind of all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as these things go.
Yes.
Speaking in terms of electrification, because right now it's just not realistic to just electrify literally everything. In your opinion, or your class's opinion, where do you think we would, as a society, benefit the most, or what would we benefit the most by electrifying? What do you think?
I think discussions around the grid are really important here. I don't know enough about it, though, to really touch on it as much as it needs to be. I know that that's a big one. I want to say transportation is a huge one. And this is why I have such issue with such prominent leaders. I mentioned Musk, regarding the switch to electric vehicles. I think that that is so huge. But I would also point out the struggle with the industrial world. Mm-hmm. So electric vehicles will just kind of acknowledge the fact that they're there and that it warrants a much larger discussion. We talked about lithium mining extensively, and I think we've made our point as far as that goes. Yeah. But when it comes to industrial and commercial type stuff, I think that's probably our biggest opportunity point there. Okay. Personally, I think that when we talk about industrial use in terms of electrical and stuff like that, that's why I said the energy grid is what needs to be addressed there, because I think that a lot of industrial places, like a lot of companies that fit into the industrial sector, will just use whatever we have.
Sure.
I don't think most of them really care that much. But when we talk about emissions, I mean, you have to bring into industrial sector is a huge not proponent, but a huge emitter of methane gas. Mm-hmm. And it's not all cow burps, although that is a thing, but which is one of my most silliest, funnest conversations to have. But when we talk about emissions strictly, truth be told, I mean, that would just be cut down tremendously if we had an energy source that wasn't fossil fuel of any kind. And that includes, as far as emissions are concerned, CO2 and methane and even fluorinated gases, because a lot of those buildings have to use refrigerants because of just heat, the fact that they get hot. All of that stuff. I'm not even talking about soil health. That's a whole other thing.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's a...
Yeah. I take a water quality class right now, and I'm learning so much, and we're not even halfway into the semester, which is wild. I'm basically a genius now on that.
I have another question. You don't have to include this in your podcast.
Yeah.
It's something worth considering. So we have, obviously, everyone knows about lobby groups and how much power they have over political leaders, and usually they're from the oil and coal and gas industry.
You had to go there. I was tiptoeing around it.
I'm going above them. And it's something people don't really think about. So consider the U.S. a very wealthy nation. We have our stock market, and we have our retirees, and we have our investment portfolios. A major chunk of those investment portfolios, oil companies, gas companies, coal companies. One of the, I think, where a lot of people maybe either forget or don't consider talking about is like, how do you make a switch in something that is propping up a humongous chunk of the population economically wise? And we're not just talking about jobs. We're talking about like, well, that's Meemaw and Peepaw's retirement.
Yep.
Or, you know, and that's with the everyman. Of course, you have these giant hedge fund managers or like Vanguard or whatever, who have like most of their giant chunks of money in these companies. It's one of those things where I always wonder, like, how on earth can we make this transition without completely collapsing our economy?
Well, I don't know the answer to some of those larger questions, but I do have... And again, you consider this an answer if you want, or a thought.
This is just me playing the devil's advocate.
No, I appreciate this, because this is a topic that I speak to a lot, and I appreciate you asking that question. A lot of people disagree with me on this, but here's how I look at it. And you and I have talked about this off air many times. I think what you're pointing at is a larger issue that is more closely related to individual and collective mental health than a lot of people like to acknowledge. And let me explain that. So I recently read a study. I'll have to do a whole other episode on the Inflation Reduction Act, because it's so massive and so broad. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages. Like, we are studying it in my class right now, and I'm just barely getting my head around all the stuff. I jokingly mentioned Hank Green earlier. If Hank Green even knows this podcast exists, I would just be floored, because Papa Hank out there, if he even knows, man, I appreciate him so much, because he helped me even understand some of the key points of the Inflation Reduction Act. The reason I mention that is because there are huge amount, because this thing is so big and so broad, and so promoting things like cleaner energy and electrification and how we're going to do that and the funding for it and all that kind of stuff. The term Inflation Reduction Act was really just a political kind of move to, like a marketing ploy, essentially, just to make it kind of more about inflation. It does affect it, but indirectly via a reduction of emissions and different things like that. It's crazy how big it is and how many things it affects. Industry, commercialism, all that stuff. One of the organizations that actually put together an incredible summary of this and how we would actually go about electrification and things that are currently at stake right now. Here's what we're looking at. Here's what we need. Here's what those things would mean. Here's like 5 options. It was a very broad and really well put together summary that a couple people put together. I'll look it up and I'll put a link to it in the show notes when we're done here, because it really is pretty amazing. One of the main sponsors and contributors to the funding of this study, surprisingly to me, was ExxonMobil.
Oh, that is surprising.
And the interesting thing about Exxon is they get a lot of flack, and I'm not defending Exxon. I want to point that out. They get a lot of hate. No, it is very open discourse. Yeah, absolutely. It is a fact. The interesting thing about Exxon, BP actually, now that I think about it too, 2 humongous worldwide fossil fuel companies, oil companies, have spent millions of dollars, lots and lots of money on environmental studies and climate change studies and emission studies. For what reason, I couldn't tell you, because I don't know the motivations of these companies. But the reason I point out mental health regarding this is because what I see a trend of with companies like ExxonMobil and BP and other industrial or oil companies or things like that, when we're trying to address these things, is that we are trying to continue using this system that we know is killing the body and the health of this planet, and also try and improve the health of it at the same time. So we're trying to continue doing the same old thing, business as usual, but then we are also trying to sort of change things at the same time somehow.
Isn't that kind of like the definition of insanity?
A little bit.
Yeah.
And so
like just tweak it.
The reason I mention mental health with that is that when you talk about these things, now granted, these organizations are run by people, but when we talk about a collective, we talk about individual health, there is, I think, a broader, more abstract and therefore difficult thing to pinpoint. But the problem that I'm trying my best to speak to, is that we have a huge outright refusal individually within our cultures. And TikTok is not helping with this in regard to improving our mental state and growing and breaking cycles, generational cycles and trauma cycles. I just spoke with Safe Passage on my last episode about domestic violence and sexual violence and how different things like porn are affecting how we look at at people in our own culture and everything like that. And one of the things that we spoke to was that these things are often brought on by generational trauma, by generational cycles. It comes down to us as individuals to identify ourselves as one of the dominoes within that line of dominoes. We have to be that domino that steps out of the way and breaks that cycle so that no more dominoes will fall, so to speak. This is one of the best visualizations I've seen that really illustrates that. So with these companies that are sponsoring all these different things, it strikes me as a really poorly motivated thing where these companies are going, look, we're helping with the research of this. And it's like, look, I'll take your money all day. That's fine. If it helps me get the study done and that, I would take that money too. But the point is that we can't have our cake and eat it too.
Sure.
We need to be able to acknowledge the fact that this goes back to your point earlier about finally accepting individual responsibility here. We need to be able to grow as human beings. Way back on like episode 7, I talked about how unless we grow and improve our own situations and our own mental health, we can't expect an entire culture to do the same thing.
Sure, absolutely.
It's not just, I don't know who this external body is that you're expecting to come and save the day. But unless we each do something, that old cliche by Gandhi saying, be the change you wish to see in the world, is something that we think sounds cute and everything, but it's more true on a mental and a spiritual level than I think we realize in regard to things like climate change and emissions and whatnot. And this is my biggest frustration with the scientific community, is that when we avoid this responsibility and we pretend that our mental health individually and therefore communally is indirectly related or not related at all to things like emissions and climate change and stuff and sustainability, I just think we're missing out on an enormous opportunity, because you can talk about the solutions. Speaking of old adages, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make this horse drink this water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We are leading our collective, our society to the water. We're already there. We've been there for ages, decades. We know the solutions. We have known the solutions. It's just that now we have more research on a broader idea, a more varied idea of what these solutions are. But what we're never talking about, and what a lot of scientists are scratching their heads over and getting so frustrated with the public over, is the fact that a growing majority of, I don't know if it's a majority, I want to be careful with my terminology here, but a growing population of people don't care.
It's interesting you say that. Just I'm going to interject real quick.
Go ahead.
When I was doing my degree, we were talking about persuasion and motivation. It's an entire class I took. And most people, I would say almost everyone, there's really no such thing as a logical decision. Almost every decision ever made is emotional, and it's informed by past experiences. You talk about generation of trauma and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But most people's decision-making skills are emotional. And I think scientists tend to forget the emotional component of human behavior.
Yeah.
And until we can actually, again, it's the same thing, like what I was talking on the break, people don't really see the consequences yet, but everything has a price and consequences will come quickly. If you want to see the, consequences of global climate change right now, just stick your face in the ocean, you'll see it very quickly. But it's the same thing. People have to have a very personal, I want to say almost, I hate to say this because this feels bad, personal traumatic experience for them to actually have the motivation to make actual change.
Yeah.
When it comes to this. And it's going back to the very beginning, science forgets the human element in human behavior. So, yeah.
I think that as someone who has struggled with, commitment issues, isolation issues, as a survival tactic for most of my life, just because of my own upbringing and my own sort of traumas and stuff that a lot of us can relate to, I'm not sure that creating online-only communities, and I mentioned TikTok and stuff, I'm not sure that's helping that. Because I don't think it is, because online communities are one thing. It's good to have support systems. I'm glad that things like BetterHelp exist. I'm glad that these things do exist. I don't want them to not exist necessarily. It's just that we are identifying these things as replacements for one-on-one.
Isn't most human communication nonverbal?
Exactly.
So how are we actually communicating at all? We're not communicating. These
So
problems aren't happening.
I bring up this stuff because we talk about we have to work together. We just have to unite. Do you really think that the general populace knows how to do that?
No.
Most people I talk to has identity crises. Most people I talk to,
because it's true.
Yeah, most people I talk to in the world have commitment issues.
Mm-hmm.
And it's usually based on traumatic things, and it's on all kinds of things that are valid.
Sure.
So when we talk about things like environmental issues and cultural issues and stuff, we are having serious disconnects with valuing ourselves and therefore other people and other communities as valid and meaningful.
Really is like that old, it's not even an old adage, it's that idea of your environment reflects your mental state. So like your room reflects your mental state.
Absolutely.
Our environment is just reflecting our collective mental state.
Yeah.
And if I could put in another episode request, which I know I've requested, I think 5 now, I would love for you to do an Indigenous wisdom and mental health episode.
That would be incredible.
I would love, because I've read a lot of Indigenous books and their take on like how they view their environment and their mental health. I would love to know. Because I know that most Indigenous communities when separated from their environment, have issues with alcoholism, drug abuse, domestic violence, stuff like that. So I would love to hear that story, because it's still very raw for most people in those communities. And I think they have a lot to teach us about how to come back to ourselves by coming back to the environment. And there's this idea of, it's an indigenous idea too, but there's a book called Nature's Last Hope that was written by, I think he was a biologist, where it's like, if you want to save yourself, go outside and stick your hands in the dirt, basically. It's just in your own backyard.
Yep.
Like, if we just made even a quarter of our backyards into like weed plots, we could save an enormous amount of pollinators. That idea, I'd love to hear some indigenous wisdom on that. You can cut that like whole me requesting, but
no, I think that is one of the biggest fields or areas of discussion points that I would have been most passionate about wanting to address, especially with like Braiding Sweetgrass being one of my favorite books of all time.
Gosh, that book has just changed my life completely.
Yeah, it's if you're unfamiliar with this book, I have mentioned it on the air here before, but it's definitely I hesitate to say indigenous. It's someone of native descent who is a scientist who combines the wisdom that she has gained growing up in this native culture and idealism with modern day science, which unfortunately are headbutting a lot. And she points that out quite a lot in the book. And I think that we're missing so many opportunities because there's this very real maternal energy that comes out of this. And one of the last points I will make is just this here, and before we end here officially, but that's really just where I tend to have the biggest frustrations and see the most opportunity in general, is that by ignoring our mental health and our spiritual health, and there is improvement with younger generations, sort of, but I also think that we're being sidelined by a lot of online communities. I don't think it's helping very much. And at the risk of sounding like a boomer here, like, I just really don't think that it's doing us a lot of good service, because without being able to say that we belong to a community, I don't understand how we expect just the world to behave like a community. It just doesn't seem realistic to me. And I just don't understand how leadership expects us to make this work when we haven't learned how. Like, I was just listening to a podcast with Rainn Wilson, Dwight, and he was talking to a guest recently about respecting yourself, and how this lady who's a horse expert, I gather, was talking about how horses will like nudge you and kind of test you a little bit.
Yeah, they will.
And she was saying, like, they want to see that you stand up for yourself. That's what they want to see. So that you're going to, like, it's like a dominance assertion. And without respecting yourself, how can you expect other people to respect you?
Sure. I believe it.
It's just not fair to your community or your friends or your loved ones to say, I need you to do the work for me because I won't do it myself. I choose not to do it myself. It is a choice. So I think a lot of our issues right now, I just think that a lot of this stuff would sound different and would feel a lot different when it comes to these broader discussions with the scientific community, with the political communities, with lobbying, with things like that. I think a lot of these issues either wouldn't exist or would sound a lot different if our focus was on improving our mental and spiritual health. And that's why I really believe that this podcast kind of blurs the line between a self-help podcast sometimes and an environmental podcast sometimes, and why I have so little interest in talking about things like recycling.
Yeah.
With someone with the name sustainability or sustainable in the title, I'm losing interest in that. We've worn that out. We're not talking about the true source of the issue, and that is caring about it in the first place.
For sure. No, and I agree with you completely. I have so many notes right now.
We'll save them because...
No, I know. I'm just letting you know, like, I've been, like, taking notes as you've been talking this entire time. So, just for my brain to stay...
I'm glad. I'm glad you're such a note taker, because I'm not, and I miss a lot of points. But do you have any final thoughts to share with us?
No, I think you cut to the heart of it quickly, and like, I almost think you should start the podcast with that last bit.
Well, We'll see.
Understanding this idea. I agree with you. I agree with you that this, my big thing is the whole anti-consumption movement. People consume to numb. There's natural consumption, like we have to eat food and we have to have shelter and stuff like this, but it's overconsumption, this idea of almost materialistic hedonism. Most people don't really want what they're going out and buying. It's a numbing agent.
It's an escape.
Health.
It's an escape.
It's absolutely. We are exceptionally good creatures at escapism. And I think escapism is good in the context of what you were saying, belonging to a community. That idea of escapism around the fire, as the elders tell stories at night. There's healthy ways to go about, like, say, consumption in a community. It's an indigenous principle. Take only what you need when you're out gathering. So we've just taken normal human behaviors and they've been exploited because we're the product now, and that's the problem. We all are struggling with mental health because we're disconnected, and we're a product now. We're not people, we're products. And I think we, at a deep level, we know that we're products. And I think that's what really...
We're either products or we're consumers.
I think we're both.
We are.
I think we're both. And that dehumanizes every single person. So why would you care about the environment if your only goal is to consume and obey, which, reference for anyone who cares.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's like 5 people in the audience that were like, woo!
But I agree with you completely. It does 100% come down to a mental health crisis. How are we going to get people to care about electrification if they can barely get out of bed in the morning, or they're struggling with trauma that happened to them as a child, or something like that?
Yeah.
So I really don't have anything to add because I think you've touched on literally everything.
Well, we did it. We solved it.
We
did it, guys.
Now.
We now know the solution to everything. We did it all. You're welcome.
Now you need to do investigative journalism to how to, now we know what it is, how do we fix it?
And how do we fix it? How do we really address it?
I think the answers lie in the past. That's my final parting words. I have a lot of things, off the record, I have a lot to think about. Like I said, I took all these notes and I'm just like, oh man,
well,
I've been out of the game for too long.
I think every time we get together and we talk about this stuff, I some apologies to the listeners. I know that our talk kind of goes long and we kind of go all over the place a little bit. I think we did a pretty decent job at keeping it somewhat on topic today, but
yeah,
I think that first off, I just want to thank you for last second. Literally, I texted Bri last night of the time of this recording and said, do you want to talk about electrification? And she was like, I don't know much about that. And I said, that's cool. That's actually better. So thank you a million times over for taking part in this conversation. And
yeah, dude, thanks for thinking of me. I love doing this kind of stuff. You know that, though.
Well, and thank you for always being a supporter of this show. And
absolutely.
And for every idea that I've ever had, you've been a huge source of feedback and sometimes correction, like appropriate correction. Peebs has always come with me and said, you need to think about this. You need to think about how you're going to put this together. You need to think about how, and it's been so incredible to have such support. You've been OG from day one, and I just can't thank you enough.
Dude. I feel so honored to be able to be part of the creative process. That's all I could ever ask for.
Well, not everyone remembers the first logo, which was the broken world thing being sewn together.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah. You were still getting used to digital animation at the time, but it is still used every now and then, and I still plan on using that sort of thing for a T-shirt or something at some point. So,
well, we should update it then, because that one does.
I fully intend. Well, until next time, I think I appreciate you guys for listening. I just can't thank you enough, Bri, for being part of this conversation. And hey, we'll see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time. And be sure to check out Blood and Earth from the library.
Blood and Earth. Thank you for mentioning that again. Oh, and for those of you, I'm going to put these links in the show notes, but I will, first off, the study that was going on about the lithium mining in Zimbabwe, I will leave the link to that. I will leave the link as well. By the way, that town, that the coal burning that's still happening is called Centralia.
Okay.
And Centralia, Pennsylvania. really incredible. Google that. It's such a rabbit hole to dive down. I'll leave links on that and all the other studies that we mentioned. So thanks again, everybody, for listening. I appreciate you guys. Well, it looks as though we have reached that point again. Alas. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I hope you picked up something out there that you can use or consider differently than you have before. Remember to mark your calendars for the upcoming trash pickup event on November 10th. Further details soon to come. Follow us on the Instagram page at Sustainable Culture Online for more info coming up just this week. You can always reach out at sustainableculture.online if you'd like to get in touch with me for any reason. Send a question for the podcast or a concern or a suggestion or whatever it is you might have. That's how you can do it. Thank you again for listening. Please rate and review us where it's applicable. It's a huge help in growing an audience and much appreciated. This has been Sustainable Culture. I've been Jet. See you all next time.